Number 3. Tim Hennis. On May 11, 1985, Gary Eastburn, an Air Force captain, called his wife, Catherine, at their home in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Gary was getting training in Alabama, and he called his wife every Saturday morning. But on that day, no one answered the phone. The next day, which was Mother's Day, a neighbor of the Eastburns noticed that 3 newspapers were on the family's driveway. He thought that the family might be away, but their car was parked a few feet from the newspapers. He went and rang the doorbell, and no one came to the door. He heard a baby crying in the house, so he got his wife to call the police. A deputy arrived a short time later and cut out a window screen. Inside the house, the very distinct odor of death hung heavy in the air. The deputy found 22-month-old Jana Eastburn, who was dehydrated, but she was alive and crying. Inside one of the bedrooms, 5-year-old Kara Eastburn was found dead on a bed. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. In the master bedroom, 2 more bodies were found. One was 3-year-old Aaron Eastburn, who had been stabbed multiple times as well. The second body was Catherine. She was naked from the waist down, and she had been stabbed 15 times. A short time before her death, she had sex or she had been raped. Gary flew back home and toured the house, and he said that a few items were missing, along with some money and an ATM card. The police interviewed the neighbors and determined that the murders happened late on Thursday, May 9th, or early on Friday, May 10th. On the afternoon that the bodies were found, a man named Patrick Cohn contacted the police. He said that at 3 a.m. on Friday, May 10th, he was heading to work and he was walking near the Eastburns' home. He saw a tall man with light hair carrying a garbage bag near the crime scene. The man was walking in the opposite direction, and when Cohn turned around, he saw the taillights of a white Chevrolet Chevette. The police got Cohn to speak with a sketch artist, and it resulted in this sketch. On Wednesday, May 15th, the local news announced that the police were looking for a man who drove a white Chevette and picked up a dog from the Eastburns address on the Tuesday before the family was murdered. 27-year-old Army Sergeant Tim Hennis saw the segment and realized that they were talking about him. He went to the police station and told them that he drove a white Chevette and he picked up the dog on Tuesday. Hennis had learned about the dog from an ad that Catherine had placed in the newspaper. The Eastburns were planning on moving to England, and they were looking for a new home for the dog. Hennis picked up the dog shortly before 9 o'clock, and he told Catherine he wanted to see how the dog got along with the dog he already had at home. The police questioned Hennis for 7 hours, and he was photographed. He gave over samples of his blood, hair, and saliva, and he also gave them his fingerprints and his palm prints. He said on the night of the murders, he drove his wife and newborn daughter to his in-laws' house in Jacksonville, Florida. He returned to Fayetteville and paid an ex-girlfriend a visit. He got home around 9 o'clock, and shortly afterwards he said that Catherine called him to see how the dogs were getting along. One thing that the police did notice was that Hennis looked a lot like the sketch drawn from Cohn's description. So they placed Hennis's photo in a photo lineup with 4 other guys with light hair and mustaches. They showed Cohn the lineup, and he picked Hennis as the man that he saw walking near the family's home. Hennis was arrested early on Thursday morning, and he was charged with the murders of Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. After the arrest, the police learned that the stolen ATM card was used twice. Once on the Friday night after the murder, and the following morning. Both times the maximum, which was $150, was withdrawn from the ATM. At the time of the murders, Hennis was about $300 behind in rent. Hennis just happened to pay the back rent on the Monday after the murders. A woman who used the ATM 3 minutes after the second withdrawal was made said that she remembered seeing a man who looked like Hennis in the area. Also, Coyne said that the man he saw was wearing a dark members-only jacket. At around 10 o'clock on Friday morning, Hennis dropped off a dark members-only jacket at a dry cleaner's. On Saturday morning, Hennis was seen by neighbors burning stuff in a barrel. The theory for the motive is that Hennis's wife was out of town and he was looking to hook up with a woman, so he went over to see his ex-girlfriend, but she turned him down. He then went over to the Eastburns' home because he knew that Gary was out of town. Catherine rejected his advances and he snapped, or he went to the home with the intention of raping her. During the trial, which began in May 1986, the district attorney showed the jury many graphic photos of the crime scene. The jury found Hennis guilty, and they sentenced him to death on July 8th. A few days after being put on death row, Hennis got a letter in the mail. It read, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." The postmark on the letter was July 8th, the day that Hennis was sentenced to die. In September 1988, his case was argued in the Court of Appeals. The North Carolina Supreme Court ended up overturning his conviction because the district attorney showed the jury crime scene photos, and this could have unfairly inflamed the members of the jury. Hennis was granted a new trial, which started in February 1989. This time, his defense team was able to add reasonable doubt to Cohn's witness account. They had a neighbor of the Eastburns, who looked a lot like Hennis, testify that he couldn't sleep that night, and he was walking around the neighborhood the same time that Cohn was walking to work. On that night, he would have been wearing a dark members-only jacket and a beanie. Another neighbor of the Eastburns was outside at 1:45, and she saw a man with long hair in a light-colored van near the family's home. His lawyers also pointed out that Cohn had been arrested several times after testifying, and the charges against him were always dismissed because he helped the district attorney. The defense team also discovered that 2 months before she was murdered, Catherine received several disturbing phone calls in the middle of the night. The caller knew her name, and he said that he was coming over to see her. They also found hair, both head and pubic, that didn't belong to Hennis or any of the Eastburns. There was also a drop of blood found on a towel inside the house that didn't belong to Hennis or the victims. Also, while Hennis did take his jacket to the dry cleaners, there were no blood stains on it, and dry cleaning wouldn't have removed all traces of blood. As for the ATM withdrawals, one of them was done while Hennis was doing an overnight shift at Fort Bragg. Another key piece of evidence were shoe prints found outside the house, and they were compared to Hennis's shoes, and they were 3 sizes smaller. Finally, while Hennis was seen burning items in a barrel, the remnants of the fire were searched, and nothing found could be linked back to the crime scene. The results of the second trial was that Hennis was acquitted of all charges, and he was released after spending 2 years on death row. After he got out of prison, he re-enlisted in the Army, and he served until 2004 when he retired. Then in 2006, the case took an unusual turn. The vaginal swabs taken from Catherine Eastburn were tested, and they got a match. The semen left inside Catherine belonged to Tim Hennis. The district attorney concluded that this proved that Hennis was guilty. The problem facing the district attorney was that Hennis had already been acquitted of the murders, so he couldn't be retried by the state because that would be double jeopardy. So he passed the information along to the Army. Officials with the Army ordered Hennis back into active duty, and then they court-martialed him for the murders. Hennis's lawyers argued that they couldn't do that because it was double jeopardy. The Army pointed out that double jeopardy only applies to one court. For example, someone can be tried at a state level and acquitted, and then be charged at a federal level. In this case, a court-martial from the Army was a different court than the state, so therefore Hennis could be charged with the murders. Hennis's court-martial began in March 2006. The tentpole of the prosecution's case was the DNA. The forensic biologists who compared the DNA said that the semen is 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to be from Hennis than any other white man in North Carolina. To refute the DNA evidence, Hennis's lawyers pointed out that an evidence custodian who worked at the police station from 1993 to 1994 was convicted for stealing guns from the same evidence room where the swabs were stored. This suggested that the evidence room wasn't as secure as it should have been. Another problem was that evidence technicians didn't wear gloves while collecting evidence at the crime scene, and this could have led to contamination. There was absolutely no documentation on how the swabs were collected and who had handled it in the 17 years since the murders. Finally, none of the other unexplained physical evidence at the crime scene, like fingerprints and hair, were a match to Hennis. Scott Wisnat, who wrote a book about the case that was published in 1993, said, "How does it happen that they got exactly the lab result they needed when all the physical evidence pointed somewhere else?" The prosecution's explanation for why only the semen linked Hennis to the crime scene was because he would have known not to leave any blood, hair, or fingerprints at the crime scene. However, in 1985, Hennis wouldn't have foreseen the rise of DNA testing, so therefore he didn't know that the semen could be linked back to him. Hennis's lawyers then argued that the sperm only proved that Hennis and Catherine had sex and didn't implicate him in the murders. He said that Hennis and Catherine could have had consensual sex, and then she was killed by someone else afterwards. The theory of a service person and the spouse of a service person having sex while their spouse was out of town did not play well with the jury made up of service people who have had to leave their spouses home alone for long periods of time. Also, Hennis, who stayed married to the same woman through all three trials, never admitted to having an affair, and always denied being at the Eastburn home that night. In the end, Hennis was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Some people, like Scott Wisnat, still believe that Hennis is innocent. Other people, like Gary Eastburn, pictured here with his daughter Jana, the only survivor of the massacre, knows that Hennis is guilty. Gary said that he has no desire to see Hennis die. Instead, he wants Hennis to rot away in a jail cell for the rest of his life. Hennis is currently sitting on death row at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison in Kansas. The executive director at the Death Penalty Information Center said that Hennis is the only person in the history of the American justice system to be sentenced to death, exonerated, and then sentenced to death again for the same crime. Number 2. Marcellus Williams. Felicia Gale was a reporter with the St. Louis Dispatch, but she left the newspaper in 1992 to do volunteer work full-time. On August 11, 1998, Gale's husband came home to the house that they shared in University City, Missouri. He found Gale brutally murdered shortly after walking in. The police arrived at the home, which was in a gated community, a few minutes later. They concluded that Gale had just finished showering, and then she came downstairs. She had been stabbed 43 times with a butcher knife from the kitchen. 7 of the wounds were considered fatal. A few things were missing from the home, including a laptop and a calculator and a ruler from the St. Louis Dispatch. The police found DNA evidence from an unknown person on the handle of the knife. They tried to create a profile based on the DNA, but the first test was inconclusive, and the case went cold. Then in June 1999, a man named Henry Cole got in contact with the police in University City. Cole said that he had been sharing a room at a workhouse with a man named Marcellus Williams. Williams, who was 30 years old, had been arrested for an unspecified crime. They spent 3 months together, and Cole said that when a news story about Gale's murder came on, Williams confessed to killing her. Supposedly, Williams gave details about the murder that weren't made public. The police thought that the tip was promising, so they interviewed Williams' girlfriend, Laura Acero. Acero said that she remembered the night of the murder. She said that Williams picked her up in his father's car and he was wearing a jacket despite it being a hot night. When he took off the jacket, she saw that he had blood on his clothes. When she asked him where the blood came from, Williams said that he had been in a fight. Williams then threw the clothes and the jacket into a sewer. Acero then said a few days later Williams sold a laptop to a friend named Glenn Roberts. The following day, Acero looked into Williams' trunk and saw a purse. When she looked in the purse, she found a piece of identification that belonged to Felicia Gale. Acero asked him about it, and he apparently confessed to murdering Gale. He said that he broke into her house and heard the shower going. He grabbed the knife and then waited for Gale to come downstairs. Afterwards, he washed up and stole the jacket to cover up the blood. Acero said that after he confessed, Williams threatened to kill her and her children if she told anyone, so she didn't go to the police. The police impounded the car that Williams was supposedly driving on the night of the murder, and they found the ruler and the calculator from the St. Louis Dispatch that came from Gale's house. They also retrieved the laptop from Glenn Roberts, and Gale's husband identified the laptop as the one stolen from the house. Williams was arrested over a year after the murder, in November 1998, and his DNA was compared to evidence found on the murder weapon. Since they didn't have a complete DNA profile, they couldn't say with certainty if the DNA belonged to Williams. Instead, the results said that Williams could not be excluded, and the DNA may belong to him. Williams went to trial in early 2000, and his jury consisted of 11 white people and 1 black person. Williams was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death on March 31, 2000. Williams was scheduled to die on August 22, 2017. Shortly before the planned execution, in a last-ditch attempt to either prove Williams' innocence or guilt, his lawyers had the DNA on the handle of the murder weapon tested again. This time, the results conclusively excluded Williams, and it belonged to an unknown male. His lawyer argued that this proves that Williams wasn't the killer. Just 3 hours before the execution, the governor of Missouri granted Williams a stay, and he is still sitting on death row. However, not everyone believes that Williams is innocent. The district attorney contends that the DNA evidence isn't enough to overcome all the other evidence linking Williams to the crime. Williams' lawyers, on the other hand, point out that there is no forensic evidence that proves that Williams was in Gale's home on the night of the murder. They also pointed out that all the witnesses who said that Williams confessed were convicted felons who may have been motivated by the $10,000 reward offered by Gale's husband. When the stay of execution was announced, the governor said that he planned to set up a board of inquiry to investigate whether Williams should be on death row. One of Felicia Gale's former co-workers at the St. Louis Dispatch wrote that she was a kind and gentle woman, and executing an innocent man would be a dishonor to the life that she lived. Number 1. Kevin Cooper. On the morning of June 5, 1983, William Hughes drove over to his neighbor's house in Chino Hills, California, to pick up his 11-year-old son Christopher, who slept over at the house. He rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. So he looked in through a window and was shocked to see some blood splatter. He managed to get inside the house, and he found the bodies of the homeowners, Douglas and Peggy Ryan, both 41, their 10-year-old daughter Jessica, and their 8-year-old son Joshua, who had his throat slit, but he was still breathing. Also in the house was his son Christopher. Sadly, he was also dead. Joshua was rushed to the hospital, and miraculously, he survived. The medical examiner determined that all the victims had been hacked or stabbed to death. The police searched the neighborhood and discovered that someone had been squatting in an unoccupied rental house near the crime scene. Based on the calls that were made from the house, they learned that the squatter was 26-year-old Kevin Cooper. Cooper had walked away from a minimum security prison 3 days before the bodies were discovered. He had been serving time for burglary. He was last seen in the area on the night that the murders were committed. They said that he killed the family to steal their station wagon, which had been dropped off in a parking lot 45 miles west of the crime scene in Long Beach. Cooper was announced as the prime suspect in the 4 murders on June 9th, and he was arrested 2 months later. There were several pieces of evidence that supposedly tied him to the crime scene. The first was a shoe print that looked like it came from a prison-issued shoe. They also found blood that was consistent with Douglas and Peggy's blood inside the house where Cooper was squatting. Also found near Cooper's temporary home was the hatchet that was used in the murders. The sheath of the hatchet was found inside the home where Cooper was staying. Cooper was found guilty, and on May 15, 1985, he was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. Cooper's lawyers appealed, but it was denied because the judges thought that there was enough evidence showing that Cooper was guilty. But even at the time of the conviction, people had strong doubts that Cooper was guilty. First off, how did Cooper manage to attack all 5 people in the house? Douglas Ryan was a 6-foot, 180-pound former Marine. Yet Cooper was able to single-handedly kill everyone in the house without injuring himself. Secondly, 3 or 4 different weapons were used in the home invasion. A knife, either an ice pick or a screwdriver, and a hatchet, which is the only murder weapon used that night that has ever been found. Why would one person use so many different weapons? The next problem revolves around the motive, which is that Cooper killed the family to steal their car. The car was found in Long Beach, which is about 45 miles west of the crime scene, and the day the bodies were found, Cooper checked into a hotel in Tijuana, Mexico at 4:30 p.m. Long Beach is an hour out of the way when heading to Tijuana from Chino Hills. If Cooper stole the car, why didn't he dump it somewhere south instead of west? Secondly, when the car was stolen, it was parked outside in front of the home, and the keys were inside the car. So why would Cooper butcher 2 adults and 2 children and slit the throat of a 3rd child when he could have stolen the car without going inside? As for the child who did survive, Joshua, he originally told the police that he thought that there were 5 attackers. He later said that it was at least 3 men. This would explain why at least 3 different weapons were used. He said that they were either white or Hispanic. Also, Joshua didn't recognize Cooper when he saw him on the news. However, after talking to the police for many hours, Joshua did later say that Cooper was the one who slit his throat. Another piece of evidence that strongly suggests someone other than Cooper committed the murders is that a blonde tuft of hair was found in Jessica Ryan's hand, suggesting her attacker was blonde. One of the biggest pieces of evidence against Cooper was a shoe print found at the crime scene. It was compared to Cooper's shoe, and it was similar, but it wasn't a match. Finally, there is strong fingerprint evidence that the sheath found in the house where Cooper was squatting was planted there afterwards. For more than a decade, Cooper languished on death row, and he was scheduled to die on February 10, 2004. Then in the early 2000s, Cooper got new lawyers and they made appeals. In 2001, he won the right to have the DNA evidence tested. There were 4 different pieces of evidence that needed to be tested. The first was a single drop of blood found at the crime scene. Second was a medium-sized tan Fruit of the Loom t-shirt found near a bar not far from the crime scene that had a little bit of blood on it that supposedly belonged to the killer. The other 2 pieces of evidence were cigarette butts found in the family's car. In October 2003, the court announced that the DNA results came back, and it was Cooper's DNA. Cooper's lawyers said that more testing was needed to determine if there were any traces of EDTA in the blood. EDTA is a common substance added to blood samples to stop them from coagulating. After Cooper was arrested, he gave a blood sample, and they would have added EDTA to it. If the blood evidence contained high levels of EDTA, it would mean that the blood was placed there after it was in a test tube. 3 months after the DNA results were announced, and a month before he was set to be executed, Cooper's lawyers applied for clemency, but Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger denied the request a few weeks later. The day before Cooper was supposed to die, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a stay until the blood was tested for EDTA. The results showed that the blood evidence contained high levels of EDTA. They also tested Cooper's blood that was in the test tube and found it actually contained Cooper's DNA and someone else's DNA. That strongly suggests that someone got Cooper's blood from the test tube, added someone else's blood to cover up the missing blood, and then planted Cooper's blood at the crime scene. Also, the only blood from Cooper that was found in the house where 5 people were hacked, stabbed, and slashed was a single drop. As for the cigarette butts, they weren't in there the first time that the car was searched. Despite the results, Cooper was not granted a new trial. He is still sitting on death row, and he has exhausted all of his appeals. He has applied for clemency 2 more times since the original clemency request. The second plea for clemency was also denied. The third was filed in February 2016, and no decision has been made on it yet. A month after it was filed, the American Bar Association sent a letter supporting clemency for Cooper. Other supporters who say that Cooper is innocent is 5 judges, a detective who was involved in the manhunt for him, and Peggy Ryan's mother. What makes Cooper's case so much more troubling is that there was evidence that pointed at other suspects that the police ignored. The first is that several people saw 3 men at a bar near the crime scene, and they were splattered with blood. They were asked to leave after being in the bar for only a few minutes. Near the bar, the police found the tan Fruit of the Loom t-shirt. Then, 4 days after the murders, the same day that Cooper was identified as the prime suspect, a woman named Diana Roper went to the police station with some bloody coveralls. She said that they belonged to her boyfriend, Lee Furrow, and told them that she thought he was involved in the murders of the Ryans and Christopher Hughes. Furrow had just been released from prison the year before the murders. He was in jail for the 1974 murder of 17-year-old Mary Sue Kitts. Cooper strangled her to death on the orders of a man named Clarence Ray Allen, and then he dumped the body in a canal. Her body has never been found. Allen was sentenced to life in prison for the murder, but he orchestrated a triple murder while behind bars, and he was sentenced to death. He was executed in 2006, making him the last inmate to be executed by the state of California. Furrow testified against Allen, and he was released in 1984. Roper said that on the night of the murders, Furrow left the house wearing a medium-sized tan Fruit of the Loom t-shirt. She remembered it because she had recently bought it for him. When he came home later that night, he wasn't wearing the shirt. Instead, he was wearing the bloody coveralls. Amazingly, the detectives never picked up the coveralls, and they were destroyed 6 months later without ever being tested. Then, shortly after the murders, a man named Kenneth Kuhn, who was incarcerated at a prison in Vacaville, California, supposedly confessed to another inmate that he and 2 other men committed the murders. He said that it was a revenge killing, but they targeted the wrong house. Cooper's lawyers contend that Kuhn and Furrow were friends, and they committed the murders with a third person. Kuhn has since denied making the confession, and Furrow has always denied being involved in the murders. The current whereabouts of both men are unknown. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please subscribe. We post a new video every Thursday and Sunday. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. The links are in the description below the video. But that's all for now. Thanks again for watching.